I was sitting in my office on the 23rd floor, looking out at the Rochester skyline, when the secretary brought in the mail. Among the business letters and invoices was a white envelope with gold embossing expensive paper, calligraphic handwriting. I recognized Ivy's handwriting at once. She'd always been obsessed with etiquette and decorum, as if properly written letters could compensate for a lack of sincerity in a relationship. I opened the envelope, already sensing that it didn't bode well. An invitation to Lance and Ivy's 5th wedding anniversary. The Blue Lagoon restaurant, a place I knew well, though the newlyweds had no idea. The date was Saturday, October 27th, 7 o'clock in the evening. The dress code is formal. The signature, Ivy and Lance Hilton, looked cold, like a business letter from the IRS rather than a family invitation from the bloodline. 5 years. How quickly time has flown by, and how drastically things have changed over the years. I remember their wedding, a lavish ceremony at the country club where Ivy played the role of a princess from a glossy magazine, and Lance obediently performed the function of a prince, diligently portraying happiness in front of the photographer's lenses. Even then I noticed how she pushed me into the background, presenting me to the guests in passing, as if I were an unavoidable addendum to the groom, an unfortunate formality that had to be endured for the sake of propriety. Ruth was still alive then. My late wife recognized her daughter-in-law's true nature, though I put her remarks down to my mother-in-law's natural jealousy of the beautiful young woman who had stolen her only son from his parents' home. How foolishly wrong I had been in not listening to the wisdom of a man who had lived with me for 42 years. Ruth had always had a remarkable intuition about people, seeing through them at a glance, as if nature had given her a special gift for discerning character. "Jack," she said to me after the engagement was announced, shaking her gray head with an expression of deep sadness, "that girl doesn't love our son. She loves the idea of what she envisions him to be, the image of a successful husband who will help her climb the social ladder." I didn't want to listen to her at the time, brushing off her warnings as senile whimsy. Lance was glowing with happiness, planning the future with burning eyes, and I didn't want to overshadow his joy with the doubts of a tired father. I thought that time would put everything in its place, that in time Ivy would get used to the family, would become warmer, more dear, would love us as we were. My naivete knew no bounds, as if I lived in the rose-colored glasses of romantic comedies. For the first 2 years after the wedding, the relationship was still afloat. We met for family dinners once a month, celebrated birthdays with cakes and gifts, exchanged Christmas and Thanksgiving presents. But even then there was a tautness in the air, as if we were all playing parts in a play where everyone knew the text, but no one believed what was happening on stage. Ivy always found reasons to cut her visits short, to take Lance away early on the pretext of important business, to avoid close communication and heart-to-heart conversations. She was a true master of polite detachment, skillfully disguising coldness under a mask of impeccable manners. After Ruth's death, everything went downhill at an astonishing rate, as if my wife had been the only thread that connected me to my son, and when death cut it off, the connection disappeared with no hope of restoration. Lance called less often, excusing himself from work. Visits stopped almost completely, and the occasional meeting became a formal obligation to be served as an unpleasant chore. He came to my mother's funeral with tear-stained eyes, hugged me tightly, as he had when I was a child. But within a week he was a stranger again, as if the moment of intimacy had been a temporary lapse of judgment. Ivy was pregnant with her firstborn when Ruth died in the hospital room. Clutching my hand and whispering her last words of love, I so hoped then that a grandchild would be a bridge between generations, an occasion for bonding and new family traditions. That maternal instinct would soften Ivy's heart, and she would realize the importance of family ties. But when little Ethan was born, with fluffy blonde hair just like Lance's as a baby, I saw him only a few times through the nursery glass or during brief visits, more like inspections. Ivy always made excuses. The baby had a cold, too late for an older person, too early and the baby was still sleeping, not the time for long visits to sick children. And then she said with a stone face that she didn't want to traumatize the impressionable boy with the sight of a constantly grieving grandfather who could pass his depression to the child. My second granddaughter, Haley, was born 2 years ago on a cold February morning. I'd only seen her twice, in the maternity ward through thick glass where she lay in a plastic crib, clutching tiny fists, and at a christening at St. Patrick's Church, where I was seated in the farthest corner, away from the altar and photographers. Ivy explained to all the guests present that I wasn't feeling well after a recent illness and preferred not to draw too much attention to myself. In fact, she just didn't want me to spoil her perfectly rehearsed picture of a happy young family from a commercial. Lance worked as a middle manager for State Farm, a major insurance company. Not a bad job with a benefits package, a steady income that allowed him to support his family in the suburbs, but nothing outstanding or impressive for his ambitious wife. Ivy, on the other hand, dreamed of a very different life, of Rochester high society, of receptions at East Avenue mansions, of charity balls and auctions, of being photographed in the society pages of local newspapers alongside the wives of bankers and politicians. My son suited her as a temporary stepping stone to her desired social status, a means to an end. But I, an ordinary 74-year-old retiree in her limited understanding, only hindered these grandiose plans to conquer the local elite. She never asked what I did before I retired, how I got my spacious house in the prestigious Brighton neighborhood, why I could afford expensive gifts and monthly transfers to my son's account with no visible signs of financial difficulties. Lance, too, showed no curiosity about the sources of his father's wealth. After high school, he left for college in Ohio, returning as a mature adult man with firm plans and clear ambitions that did not include close contact with his parents. We had begun to drift apart before he married Ivy, and she only accelerated that natural process into a rapid descent into the abyss of estrangement. I never told my son about the true scale of my business, never bragged about my accomplishments or demanded recognition. I started with one tiny cafe on the outskirts of town 40 years ago, when Lance was still in kindergarten, worked 16 hours a day without weekends or vacations, invested every dollar I earned in the development of the business, saved on everything, including my own clothes and entertainment. Ruth was the only person on earth who knew the struggles I went through to build an empire of 23 restaurants across New York State, the sacrifices I made, and the sleepless nights I spent on the books. She died of pancreatic cancer, taking my success story and all the memories of the arduous journey to the top with her to the grave. Maybe I should have told Lance the truth about my life someday. Show him the founding documents of the company, introduce him to the restaurant managers, give him a detailed tour of the head office with its modern equipment and staff of 50 employees. But pride did not allow me to grovel and beg for attention. If my own son is not interested in the life and achievements of his father, does not ask questions, and does not show curiosity, why impose with stories about the past? If he prefers to see me as an infirm old man on a modest pension who lives out his life alone, let him remain in his ignorance. The invitation lay on the polished surface of the table, a reminder of the important decision to be made. Should I go to the gala or ignore the invitation on the pretext of ill health? On the one hand, it was a family event, the 5th wedding anniversary of his only son, a last chance to try to restore the lost link between generations. On the other hand, it was almost guaranteed humiliation, demonstrative coldness, and disdain on the part of Ivy, who must have prepared new ways to show me my place in their ideal world without unnecessary relatives. But still, they'd sent the invitation, spent time on the pretty envelope and the calligraphic curlicues, so some part of Lance's soul still remembers his father's existence, that we were once close. Maybe we should try to reconnect one last time. Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual, even though my alarm clock was set for 8 o'clock. Outside my bedroom window, the October dawn was graying, and the bare branches of the maple trees in the yard swayed in the light breeze. Anniversary day. The day I'd been putting off in my mind all week, as if I could change its approach by sheer force of will. I showered, shaved extra carefully, picked out my best suit, the dark blue Armani that Ruth had bought me for my 70th birthday. She had said then that she wanted to see me elegant for the rest of my life. That age was no reason to look sloppy. How right she was about everything, my clever wife. I picked up a silver tie, cufflinks, the same gold ones I wore to my own wedding 48 years ago. But first I had to decide on a gift. What do you give a son and daughter-in-law on a 5-year anniversary when the relationship is on the verge of rupture? Money would seem too formal a gesture, jewelry too personal, travel, But they already go on vacation regularly, not lacking in funds thanks to my monthly support, which Ivy prefers not to think about. I went to an antique store on Park Avenue where I was well known. The owner, an elderly Jew named Sam Rosenberg, immediately understood my dilemma. "Something special for a special occasion?" he asked, wiping his glasses with a soft cloth. "A gift for his son and his wife." "Wedding anniversary," I explained, looking through the display cases of china and silver. Sam nodded understandingly and led me to the far corner of the store where the antique clock stood. He showed me a 19th century mahogany floor clock, elegant, with a melodious chime and elaborate carvings. "A family heirloom," he explained. "The clock symbolizes the time spent together and the time yet to come." The price was a hefty $8,000, but money didn't matter now. If this was my last gesture of reconciliation, let it be worthy. Arrangements were made to have it delivered directly to the restaurant by early evening. After the antique store, I went to Old Port, one of my restaurants in the historic center of the city. I especially like this place for its atmosphere. Brick walls, wooden beams under the ceiling, a fireplace in the corner of the room. It served the best lobster in Rochester, and the steaks were cooked so well that regulars made reservations a month in advance. The manager, Frank McCormick, was waiting for me in his office on the second floor. This red-haired Irishman had worked for me for 15 years, starting as a waiter and rising to manager through hard work and honesty. I trusted him more than some of my relatives. "Shalom. Mr. Hilton, welcome," he greeted me, rising from the table. "Coffee or perhaps something stronger? We have some excellent Irish whiskey." "Coffee will be fine," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "How are things going with the new seafood supplier?" Frank poured coffee from a silver thermos and slid the cup toward me. His face darkened. "Trouble, sir. Quality is down and prices are up 20%. Had to return a shipment of oysters yesterday. Half of them were stale. Customers are starting to complain. We discussed options to solve the problem. We could go back to the old supplier, even though it was more expensive, or we could look for new partners in Boston." I leaned towards the first option. The restaurant's reputation was worth more than the temporary savings. "How's the expansion project coming along?" I asked, sipping my hot coffee. Frank perked up and pulled out a folder of plans. The architect had finalized the designs. "We can add 20 tables if we take down the wall between the main room and the banquet room, but we'd have to move the kitchen, and that would be a major expense." I studied the blueprints, visualizing what the renovated space would look like. The investment would pay for itself in 2 years, given the popularity of the place. But another thing bothered me. Who would I hand it over to when the time came? "Frank," I said, putting the plans aside, "have you ever thought about owning your own restaurant?" He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Honestly, I have. But where would I get the startup capital? Banks are reluctant to give loans for restaurant business, and I don't have rich relatives." "And if there was an opportunity to become a partner in an existing business?" I asked. "Hypothetically." Frank's eyes lit up, but he answered with restraint. "That would be a dream come true, sir. But I realize that offers like that don't just happen." I got up and went to the window that overlooked the Genesee River. Downstairs, people were scurrying about, going about their business, unaware that the owner of the restaurant where they sometimes dined was standing one floor above, pondering the future of his empire. That's not how I started out. 40 years ago, I bought a tiny cafe, Mary's, on the outskirts of Rochester for $12,000. All my savings after serving in the Army and working at the plant Kodak. The place was in terrible condition. Leaky roof, broken stove, shabby walls. But the rent was a penny and the location was good, next to a bus stop and a small office center. For the first 6 months, I worked alone, without weekends. I cooked, served customers, washed dishes, and shopped at the market. Ruth helped in the evenings, keeping simple accounts in a school notebook. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to live on and make gradual improvements. First, I bought a new stove, then repaired the roof, then repainted the walls a cheerful yellow color. The breakthrough happened in the second year of business. A large insurance company opened in a nearby office center, and its employees began to eat lunch at our place regularly. We had to expand the menu, hire an assistant, and increase the number of tables. Money started coming in faster than I had time to spend it on development. I bought the third restaurant 5 years after the first. It was already a serious establishment in the city center, with a full kitchen and wine list. Ruth came up with the name the Golden Anchor. She insisted that I hire a professional chef and not try to cook everything myself. Jack, she said, you're a good cook, but you're a better businessman. Do what you do best. She was right, as always. I focused on finding new locations, negotiating with suppliers, managing finances. By 35, I had 7 restaurants. By 40, 15. By 50, 23. Each establishment had its own character, its own audience, its own zest. Family Hearth specialized in home cooking, Sea Breeze in fish and seafood, Butcher's Yard in steaks and barbecue. Lance grew up in the midst of it all, but seemed completely uninterested in the restaurant business. As a kid, he sometimes helped out on weekends, wiping down tables, passing out menus, putting napkins in baskets. But he did it without enthusiasm, as if he was doing his chores. In high school, he preferred to work at summer camps or the library, anywhere but in the family business. Dad, he told me at dinner one night when he turned 17, I don't want to do restaurants. It's not my thing. I didn't insist. Everyone has the right to choose their own path, and coercion rarely leads to good results. I paid his college tuition, supported him financially during his studies, and was proud of his economics degree, but the bond between us was gradually weakening, as if Lance was deliberately distancing himself from the world his father had created. After he married Ivy, that distance turned into an abyss. She had never hidden her opinion about the restaurant business. She considered it not prestigious enough for her husband's family. In her mind, real success was measured not by the number of establishments and profits, but by belonging to a select circle, going to the right clubs and meeting the right people. Mr. Hilden? Frank's voice brought me back to reality. Did you have something to say about the partnership? I turned to him and smiled. Just musings for now, Frank. But someday I'm going to need someone I can trust with all of this. Think about it. We discussed current affairs for another half hour. Then I said goodbye and went home to get ready for the evening. The day was coming to an end and there was a test ahead, the outcome of which could determine the future of my relationship with my only son. The Blue Lagoon restaurant was located in a historic building on East Avenue, in what the locals proudly called our Broadway. It had once been a bank, with massive columns at the entrance and high ceilings with stucco decorations. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a while, watching the guests enter the golden-lit lobby. Through the wide windows, I could see waiters in white shirts and black bow ties scurrying between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Live music, a string quartet, judging by the sounds coming from the street. Ivy hadn't skimped on the festivities as one might expect. She always threw a big party, as if every event in her life was meant to be a role model. I recognized many of the guests. Lance's colleagues at the insurance company, neighbors in the neighborhood, a few married couples from their social circle, women in evening gowns and jewelry, men in strict suits. A typical middle-class crowd, striving to look richer and more successful than they really are. It was the kind of company Ivy felt comfortable in. I checked the time on my watch. It was 15 to 8. It was time to go, though every step was hard, as if my legs were filled with lead. I took a box of antique watches out of the trunk, a gift card for an antique watch that had been delivered, just as Sam Rosenberg had promised. I took a deep breath of the cold October air and headed for the entrance. A doorman in a uniform livery opened the heavy glass door in front of me. Sanum. Welcome to the Blue Lagoon, sir, he said with a professional smile. Thank you. I'm here for the Hilton family party, I replied, adjusting my tie. Of course, sir. The banquet is in the main hall. Please. The foyer greeted me with the muffled hum of conversations and the sound of music. The smell of expensive perfume mingled with the scent of floral arrangements. White roses and lilies. Lots of white, apparently symbolizing the purity of marriage. On the walls hung photos of the newlyweds. Professional photos from their wedding 5 years ago, romantic shots from their honeymoon in Italy, family portraits with their children. I was saddened to notice that most of the photos showed only their little family. It was as if the parents didn't exist in their perfect world. In the center of the foyer was a large board with the wishes of the guests. People left warm notes about love, fidelity, and many years of happiness. I read a few trite phrases that are written at all such celebrations. We wish you many years of marital happiness. May your love grow stronger every year. Keep each other and appreciate every moment. I signed it too, writing in careful letters. Best wishes from a loving father. Dad? I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around and saw Lance. My son looked older than his 32 years. The bald spots on his temples that hadn't been there a year ago. The tired eyes, the small belly under his expensive suit. His job at the insurance company and his family life were clearly not easy for him. But he was smiling. And that smile brought me back for a moment to the times we'd been close. Lance, I said, extending my hand to him. Congratulations on your anniversary. He shook my hand, but there was no hug. It was formal, like a handshake between strangers in a business meeting. Thanks for coming. Yeah, we weren't sure you'd be able to make it. How could I miss such an important event? Lance nodded, but I could read the confusion in his eyes. Apparently there had been a time when they'd discussed my possible no-show with Ivy, and from the looks of it, she wouldn't mind my absence. My son was dressed in a dark gray suit from a good tailor, a white shirt, and a navy tie. He wore a small boutonniere of white roses on his lapel, just like the one he'd worn at the wedding. Synonym. You look great, I said, and it was true, despite the signs of fatigue. Family life suits you. Yeah, it's good. Work, home, kids. The usual life, you know. There was a certain bitterness in his tone, as if ordinary life wasn't what he'd dreamed of when he was young. But I did not dig deeper. Today was not the day to find out. And where is the guilty party? I asked, looking around. Ivy is in the hall accepting congratulations. Come on, I'll walk you out. We moved through the foyer to the arched passageway leading to the main room of the restaurant. On the way, Lance greeted a few guests casually, introduced me as his father, and I noticed people giving me appraising glances, probably trying to figure out why a humble insurance agent would have a parent in such an expensive suit. The main hall was striking in its elegance. The tables were covered with snow-white tablecloths with silverware and crystal glasses. In the center of each table, compositions of white roses and candles in tall candlesticks. The lighting is subdued, creating an intimate atmosphere. In the far corner of the room, a string quartet was playing classical melodies, something from Vivaldi, if I'm not mistaken. And then I saw Ivy. She was standing at the window, surrounded by a group of women, holding a glass of champagne and talking animatedly. She was wearing a long, deep emerald-colored dress that emphasized her slender figure, and around her neck sparkled a diamond necklace that I was sure was worth more than most people earned in a year. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, her makeup flawless, her smile dazzling. In her 30s, she looked like a model from Vogue magazine. Noticing our approach, Ivy apologized to her companions and walked toward us. Her gait was majestic, as if she were floating down the red carpet of a premiere, not just crossing the restaurant hall. Every movement was designed for effect, every gesture thoughtful. Jack, she said when we were next to each other, what a surprise. Her tone was polite but cold, as if she were talking to an unwelcome but unavoidable guest. No hug, no warm words. She held out her hand for a formal handshake, and I noticed her gaze sliding over my suit, assessing its value and appropriateness. Ivy, you look beautiful, I said, shaking her cold palm. Congratulations on your anniversary. 5 years is a big deal. Yeah, time flies, she said, not showing any enthusiasm. Thank you for taking the time to come. Made time, as if I were a busy man with every minute to spare. In her mind, I probably sat at home in front of the TV all day, and coming to the gala was a rare distraction. I have a present for you, I said, holding out a beautifully wrapped box. Ivy took the gift with an expression of polite bewilderment, as if she didn't understand why elderly relatives spent money on things they didn't need. That's very nice of you, Jack. Really, I shouldn't have bothered. No worries at all. I hope you enjoy it. Lance peered over his wife's shoulder, trying to guess the contents of the box by its size and weight. What is it, Dad? An antique clock, 19th century, mahogany, an heirloom like the seller said. Ivy nodded with the same polite smile one would use to thank a distant aunt for an unwanted sweater. How original. Thank you. She handed the box to Lance without even attempting to open it. Obviously, an antique watch didn't fit her idea of an appropriate gift. Perhaps she was expecting something more modern and practical. Well, Ivy said, looking around, I need to talk to the other guests. Lance, show Daddy his place at the table. And she left, leaving the two of us alone. Lance looked awkward, like he was apologizing for his wife's coldness, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Come on, let's go find your seat, he said, taking me under his arm. We walked between the tables, and I noticed that many of the guests were looking at us with curiosity. Some were whispering among themselves, obviously discussing the appearance of a mysterious elderly relative. Lance stopped at each table, introducing me as his father, but never mentioned my name or any details about my life. This is my father, he said with a strained smile. He lives here in Rochester. People nodded politely, shook my hand, said the usual phrases about family values and the importance of the older generation being present at such events. But I saw questions in their eyes. Who is this person? What does he do? Why is he so rarely seen at family celebrations? My place was at the far table, away from the presidium where the newlyweds were sitting. Next to me was an elderly couple, the parents of one of Lance's co-workers, who looked as lost as I did. The woman introduced herself as Martha, the man as Charles. They were nice people, but our conversation didn't flow. There were too few common themes between casual companions at a banquet table. The waiter brought the menu, and I studied the assortment of dishes with interest. The cuisine was not bad, but not outstanding. A standard set of a mid-level restaurant. Oysters, Caesar salad, filet mignon, grilled salmon. Prices are overpriced, but it's normal for downtown establishments that live off corporate clients and special occasions. A string quartet changed Vivaldi's melody to something more modern, a jazz treatment of classical standards. The musicians played professionally but without soul, as if they were performing a familiar job for good money. I caught a glimpse of the violinist, a young guy with long hair and tired eyes, and nodded my approval. He responded with a barely perceptible smile. Ivy, meanwhile, fluttered from table to table, accepting congratulations and showing off her immaculate dress. She was the hostess, the star of the evening, the center of attention. She was exactly what I had envisioned her to be, a woman who lived for public recognition, for admiring glances and envious whispers. Lance followed her like a faithful companion, nodding in the right places, laughing at the right moments, playing the role of devoted husband. But I knew my son well enough to notice the tension in his posture, the weariness in his eyes. He played his part the way musicians played their tunes technically, but without genuine joy. As Ivy approached our table on her rounds, I heard her introduce me to the new group of guests. And this is Lance's father, Jack. He's retired, lives alone in the suburbs. We try to keep in touch with him, though he prefers his privacy. The tone was sympathetic, as if he were a sick relative who had to be cared for out of a sense of duty. She used the word seclusion with particular emphasis, suggesting that I had chosen to isolate myself from my family. The guests nodded understandingly, casting sympathetic glances at me. A poor, lonely old man who had lost his wife and lived with memories of the past. How good it is that young people do not forget their obligations to the older generation. I sat in silence, clutching a glass of mineral water in my hand. Ivy's every word hit the target, creating the image she wanted of the situation. She wasn't lying. Technically, all of her words were true, but the truth, served with a certain sauce, could hurt more than a straight lie. Dinner was served at 9:30. The first course was pumpkin cream soup with coconut milk. Delicious but too sweet for my taste. Main course, beef medallions with truffle sauce and grilled vegetables. The meat was cooked well, but the sauce was overly rich, overpowering the natural flavor of the product. At neighboring tables, there were lively conversations about work, children, vacation plans, the usual topics of ordinary people living ordinary lives. I listened to the fragments of phrases and thought about how far I'd strayed from this simple human happiness. Ruth and I had once had such dinner conversations, such plans and dreams. During dessert, tiramisu with raspberry sauce, Lance made a toast. He stood up, took the champagne glass in his hands and tapped it with a silver spoon, attracting the guests' attention. Dear friends, he began, and the room slowly quieted. Thank you for sharing this special date with us. 5 years ago, I married the most beautiful woman in the world, and every day since then confirms the rightness of my choice." He turned to Ivy, who was glowing with pleasure. "Darling, you've made me a better man. You gave me two wonderful children. You've created a home that I want to come back to every night. To you, to us, to our family." Everyone raised their glasses and the room filled with applause. Ivy stood up and kissed her husband, posing for the photographer who didn't miss a single moment. I raised my mineral water glass as well, but felt no joy. My son's words sounded right, but somehow mechanically, as if he was reciting a memorized speech. After the toast, the musicians played a romantic melody, and Lance invited Ivy to the first dance. They twirled around the makeshift dance floor in the center of the room, and all the guests watched them with amusement. A beautiful couple, a model family, a success story of young people who built their happiness with their own hands. But that's not what I saw. I saw how Ivy controlled every movement, how she smiled at the camera without looking her husband in the eye. I saw Lance diligently feigning happiness, even though his shoulders were tense and his smile didn't reach his eyes. The evening went on, but I was already realizing that my mission had failed. There would be no reconciliation, no revival of family ties. I remained a stranger in this world where everything was beautiful, right, and completely empty. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the atmosphere in the room had become more relaxed. The champagne and wine had done their job. Voices were louder, laughter became more raspy, and conversations less restrained. The string quartet was replaced by a DJ who started spinning modern hits, and a few young couples went dancing. I sat at my table watching and occasionally exchanging pleasantries with Martha and Charles. The older couple turned out to be quite nice. He was retired after a long career as a police officer. She was a school teacher. Simple people with simple joys who were genuinely proud of the successes of their children and grandchildren. "What did you do before you retired, Jack?" Martha asked, sipping from a glass of white wine. "The restaurant business," I answered evasively. "Nothing much." "Oh, how interesting." She perked up. "You probably know all the best places in town. What about this restaurant?" I looked around, assessing the service, the quality of service, and the general atmosphere of the place. "Not bad," I said diplomatically. "A good place for special occasions." In fact, I could tell a lot of interesting things about the management of this restaurant. I knew the owner, a young entrepreneur named Brian Caldwell, who had bought the building 3 years ago and invested a lot of money in renovations. Knew his suppliers, his approximate profits, his staffing problems. In the restaurant business, everyone knows each other, especially in a small town like Rochester. Ivy, meanwhile, continued her triumphant round of guests. She was in her element, accepting compliments, posing for pictures, telling stories about family life. Her voice grew louder and more confident with each glass of champagne she drank, and her gestures became more theatrical. Around 11:30, she found herself at our table with three other women, the wives of Lance's co-workers, judging from their conversation. All of them were dressed expensively and tastefully, all showing off their family's success through jewelry, handbags, and hairstyles by the best craftsmen in town. "Girls, meet Ivy," Ivy said, gesturing toward me. "This is Lance's father, Jack. He's been living alone since his wife died, and we're trying to support him as best we can." The women turned to me with that expression of polite sympathy one usually shows at the mention of elderly relatives. One of them, a slender blonde woman of about 35, extended her hand to me. "Nice to meet you, Jack. I'm Caroline, Robert's wife from the underwriting department. How nice of you to be able to come to such an important celebration." "Thank you," I replied, shaking her hand. "I'm glad to be here." "Robert, where do you usually spend your time?" another woman asked, a redhead with big earrings. "I guess there are some hobbies, interest groups for people your age?" The question sounded patronizing, as if she were talking about leisure activities in a nursing home. I noticed Ivy tense up slightly, waiting for my answer. Obviously, she wasn't sure if I'd answer in the way she wanted. "I'm not old enough to need special programs yet," I said with a slight smile. "I mostly just do things." "What kind of things?" Caroline asked with genuine curiosity. Ivy answered hastily for me. "Oh, just little things. Gardening, housework, seeing friends. You know what it's like when you get older. You want peace and quiet." She said it in a tone that did not allow any objections, as if it were an indisputable fact. The women nodded understandingly, and the conversation moved smoothly to other topics: vacation plans, children's school achievements, new fashion trends. I sat in silence, listening to their chatter and feeling the irritation building in me. Not so much at Ivy's words, but at her tone, the way she presented the information. She was creating a certain image of an infirm old man living on his pension and needing the care of his young relatives. And this image became a reality in the eyes of others. "Have you thought about moving to a special place for the elderly?" asked a third woman, dark-haired with attentive brown eyes. "You know, there are such wonderful communities where people your age can find new friends, do interesting activities." "Maggie's right," Ivy said. "Lance and I talk about it all the time. Jack lives in a big house that's hard for an older person to maintain alone. It would be wise to move to a more suitable place." "I'm doing fine in my own house," I said firmly. "Shemanaturn, I'm not going anywhere." "Sure, sure," Ivy agreed hastily, but I could hear the irritation in her voice. "We're just concerned for your safety. Things can happen at your age." "At my age, a lot of people are still working and traveling the world," I countered. 74 is not a judgment." There was an awkward pause. The women looked at each other, unsure how to react to the sudden family disagreement. Ivy blushed with embarrassment and anger. "Jack, dear," she said through gritted teeth, "perhaps we should discuss this later, in a more appropriate place." "Maybe," I agreed, but I wasn't about to back down. "I don't see why I can't tell the truth here and now, though." "What truth?" Ivy asked, a note of steel in her voice. "The truth about who I was and what I did. The truth that my house is worth more than your husband makes in 10 years. The truth that I don't need anyone's care and support." Ivy's face turned white, then red. The women around us fell silent, sensing the tension building. A few people at neighboring tables turned their heads in our direction. "What are you talking about?" Ivy hissed. "Have you been drinking more than you should?" "I haven't had alcohol in 20 years, I replied calmly. "And I'm completely sober, unlike some people." Ivy jumped up from her chair, her eyes glittering with rage. Her hair was disheveled, her flawless makeup smeared with sweat. The elegant lady had turned into an enraged woman losing control of the situation. "How dare you!" she shouted so loudly that the music seemed quieter. "How dare you spoil our celebration with your ravings of an old merismatic?" The hall gradually quieted down. The DJ turned down the volume, the conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to our table. Lance hurried toward us, his face showing panic and confusion. "Ivy, what's going on?" he asked, running up to his wife. "Your father's lost his mind," she shouted, pointing her finger at me. "He's talking nonsense about money, about the house. He must be getting senile dementia." I stood up from the table, feeling all eyes focused on me. 150 people were watching the family scandal like a play in a theater. Some pulled out their phones, preparing to take video. "Lance," I said quietly, "explain to your wife who I am." My son looked at me puzzled. "Dad, what are you talking about? What's going on?" "He doesn't know," I realized. "You really don't know." Ivy smiled triumphantly. "Of course he doesn't know, because there's nothing to know. You're just an ordinary pensioner who thinks he's a millionaire." She turned to the crowd of onlookers and announced in a theatrical voice, "Sorry about this unpleasant scene. Elderly people sometimes have episodes of inadequacy. We will solve this problem immediately." Then Ivy gestured to the security guard, a large man in a black suit, who stood at the entrance to the hall. "Would you be so kind as to escort this gentleman to the exit?" she said in an official tone. "He is not well and may inconvenience the other guests." The guard approached our table, politely but firmly. He was a man in his 40s, with a military bearing and attentive eyes. He was clearly used to dealing with various unpleasant situations. "Sir," he addressed me respectfully, "I'm afraid you'll have to leave the establishment. It's nothing personal." "Of course," I agreed, "but I'd like to speak to the manager first." "Why?" Ivy asked suspiciously. "I want to apologize for disturbing you." The guard nodded and gestured to the waiter. "Jimmy, get Mr. Caldwell. Tell him it's a delicate situation." A few minutes later, the owner of the restaurant, Brian Caldwell, a man of about 38, wearing an expensive suit and a concerned expression on his face, appeared. He quickly assessed the situation with a professional's eye and headed straight for me. "What's the problem?" he asked, but stopped abruptly when he saw me. "Mr. Hilton?" "Good evening, Brian," I said. "I'm sorry to bother you." The young restaurant owner's face was completely bewildered. He looked from me to Ivy, trying to understand what was going on. "Mr. Hilton, what's going on here? Why was Mark going to escort you out?" The guard named Mark looked confused too. "Brian, this lady asked me to remove an elderly gentleman from the room," he explained. "Said he was acting inappropriately." Caldwell turned to Ivy, a look of amazement in his eyes. "Miss, do you realize who you're talking to? This is Jack Hilton. He owns 23 restaurants in the state, including half of Rochester's finest." Ivy opened her mouth but didn't say a word. Her face went from red to pale green. Her eyes widened with shock. The women who stood beside her also froze in mute amazement. "Moreover," Caldwell continued, "Mr. Hilton was my mentor when I first started in the restaurant business. Without his advice and support, this place would not exist." Lance stepped closer, his face a look of utter incomprehension. "Dad, is it true? You really, own restaurants?" 23, I confirmed calmly. "I started with a small cafe 40 years ago." "But why didn't you ever tell me?" "You never asked." There was dead silence. 150 people were digesting the information they had heard. Many pulled out their cell phones, checking the internet for information on Jack Hilton. Some were whispering among themselves, discussing the unexpected turn of events. Ivy stood motionless, as if turned into a wax figure. Her triumphant evening had collapsed in an instant into a public humiliation. All her attempts to paint me as a feeble old man had backfired on her. "Mr. Hilton," Caldwell said in an apologetic tone, "I apologize profoundly for this misunderstanding. If there is anything I can do—" "Thank you, Brian. It's okay." I turned to Ivy, who was still standing with glassy eyes. "Goodbye, Ivy. Thanks for the invitation. It's been enlightening evening." After my words, the hall seemed to freeze as if waiting for the play to continue. The guests stood and sat in absolute silence, digesting the information they had heard and trying to understand how to react to such an unexpected turn of events. Some of them had managed to find information about my company on the internet and showed their phone screens to their neighbors, confirming the authenticity of Brian Caldwell's words. Ivy finally woke up from her stupor. Her face took on an unhealthy grayish tint, and her trembling hands instinctively reached for the diamond necklace around her neck, as if it could serve as a shield against impending shame. She looked around quickly, assessing the scale of the disaster, and I saw in her eyes the panic of a man who realizes that his carefully constructed world is crumbling right in front of his audience. "This is some kind of mistake," she whispered, turning to Caldwell. "You must have him confused with someone else. Jack is a retired man. He can't be a restaurant owner." Brian shook his head with an expression of genuine sympathy for the woman who was clearly in a state of shock. "Ma'am, I've known Mr. Hilton for 7 years. He was a major investor when I bought this building. Without his support, the Blue Lagoon would not have been able to open." "But that can't be!" Ivy exclaimed, her voice growing higher and more hysterical. "I've known this man for 5 years. He lives in an ordinary house, drives an old car, dresses plainly." Several of the guests at nearby tables glanced over with expressions of embarrassment. Some tried to pretend they didn't hear what was happening, staring at their phones or eating, but most of them were watching the drama unfold. The music played softly, like a background accompaniment to a family scandal. Lance stepped closer to his father, his face a mixture of amazement, confusion, and something else, perhaps embarrassment, at his own ignorance of his own life. "Papa," he said quietly, "I don't understand. If you really own all these restaurants, why didn't you ever tell us about it?" I looked at my son carefully, studying his face, trying to figure out what he was feeling at that moment. Surprise, definitely. Embarrassment, too. But where was the outrage at his wife's behavior? Where was the anger at the way Ivy had treated his father? Where was the basic desire to protect a loved one from public humiliation? "Did you ask?" I answered a question with a question. "In all these years, have you ever once asked what I do, how I live my life, what bothers me?" Lance opened his mouth to say something, but I couldn't find the words. He stood in front of me like a schoolboy caught not knowing his lesson. And it was painful to see my grown son, who suddenly realized he knew nothing about his own father's life. I thought you'd tell me if you wanted to, he mumbled at last. And I thought that if a son loved his father, he would show interest in his life without special invitations. Ivy, meanwhile, was trying to take control of the situation. She straightened up, squared her shoulders, and tried to regain her status as mistress of the situation. All right, she said louder, addressing the guests. Let's assume that's true. Suppose Jack does have some business, but that doesn't excuse his behavior tonight. What kind of behavior? I asked calmly. You came in here and started bragging about your money, she accused, pointing a trembling finger at me. You decided to spoil our party with your tales of wealth. I was just correcting you when you told people untruths about my life. What untruths? I said you were a retired man. You said I was a frail old man who needed a nursing home. Several of the women in Ivy's company lowered their eyes guiltily. They remembered the conversation about moving to a special community for the elderly and now realized how awkward their advice sounded to a man who could buy such a facility outright. I was looking out for your well-being. Ivy defended herself, but her voice sounded less and less convincing. You made me look like a burden to be tolerated out of politeness. That's not true, Kamino Mom. Then why did you just demand that I be escorted out of the restaurant? Ivy was silent again, realizing that every word she said was making things worse. The guests were watching this fight with intense attention, and many of them clearly sympathized with me. It was becoming obvious who was the victim and who was the aggressor in this situation. Lance tried to intervene, playing the role of peacemaker. Dad, Ivy just didn't know. If we understood the scale of your business, what would have changed? I interrupted him. Would you treat me better if you knew about my money? No, of course not. It's just that, we'd talk more, spend more time together. Why? Because I'm rich. Lance was confused, realizing he was walking into a trap. Any answer to that question made him look bad. Dad, you're misunderstanding. Yep, I'm getting it right, son. In 5 years of marriage, you never once stood up for me when your wife turned every family meeting into an execution. You watched in silence as she poisoned our relationship. And even today, when she publicly humiliated me, you didn't say a word in my defense. But I didn't understand what was going on. And do you have to understand the details to protect your own father from being insulted? The hall listened attentively to our conversation. Many guests nodded in agreement with what I was saying. Family values, respect for elders, protection of loved ones. These simple truths were clear to everyone present, and it was obvious that Ivy was the offender in this situation, not me. Caldwell discreetly took the guard aside and explained something quietly. Mark nodded and stepped back against the wall, signaling that the incident was over and no one would be escorted out. The DJ gradually turned up the volume of the music, hinting to the guests that it was time to get back to celebrating. Ivy tried once again to take the lead. Okay, she said in a conciliatory tone. There may have been a misunderstanding, but the important thing is that we're all here. We're a family. Let's forget this unpleasantness and continue celebrating. She held out her hand to me with a strange smile designed for the audience. Jack, I'm sorry if I was too harsh. I was just worried about you. I looked at the outstretched hand, but didn't respond to the gesture. Ivy, you weren't harsh. You were cruel. You've systematically humiliated me for 5 years, and today you just perfected your art. Anra, that's not fair, she was outraged. I've always treated you with respect. You forbade me to see my grandchildren. I did not forbid. It's just that the kids are little. They need a routine. You canceled family dinners on flimsy excuses. We had important things to do. You presented me to guests as a burden to be endured out of pity. I never said that. Caroline, one of the women who had been standing nearby during our quarrel, suddenly intervened in the conversation. Excuse me, but I heard you talking about a special place for the elderly and about Jack's preference for privacy. Ivy blushed, realizing that there were witnesses to her words. That's not what I meant. What exactly did you mean? Maggie, the other woman in the group, asked. Yeah, I was concerned for his comfort. Ivy's explanation sounded weaker and weaker. The women who half an hour ago had nodded sympathetically as they listened to her stories about her infirm father-in-law now looked at her with disapproval. Lies tended to disintegrate quickly under the weight of facts. Lance tried to salvage the situation. Dad, let's talk about this at home, in a quiet environment. It's a holiday. We don't want to ruin it with a family squabble. Family? I interjected. Lance, you're missing the point. We don't have a family anymore. It ended 5 years ago when you chose between your father and your wife. And you chose your wife. That's not true. I didn't choose anyone. Silent consent is also a choice. But I love you. You're my father. And I love you, son. That's why I'm leaving. I turned to Caldwell, who had been standing aside all this time, hesitant to interfere in family matters. Brian, thank you for your hospitality. It's a lovely establishment. Great food. Mr. Hilton, he said with sincere regret, I'm sorry the evening was so unfortunate. On the contrary, I replied, it was very revealing. I went out without turning around. I could hear voices behind me. Ivy explaining something to the guests. Lance trying to calm his wife. People discussing what had happened. But it didn't concern me. I was walking through a restaurant that I could have bought with one phone call, past people who an hour ago thought I was a worthless old man. Lance caught up with me on the way out. Dad, wait, he shouted, grabbing my arm. We can fix this. We can start over. I stopped and looked at my son. There was genuine pain in his eyes, and for a moment I wanted to hug him, forgive him, and try to repair the relationship. But then I remembered the 5 years of humiliation, the ban on seeing his grandchildren, the way he had stood by and kept silent while his wife insulted his father. Lance, I said quietly, you're a good man, but you're a weak man, and it's not your fault you were born that way. Just live happily with your wife and don't feel bad about it. But we're a family. We were a family. I carefully released my hand and walked out into the cold October night. Behind me was a holiday that had turned from a celebration of love into a story about how easy it is to lose the most important thing, thinking it will last forever. The cold October air hit my face like a slap in the face, sobering me up and bringing me back to reality after the stuffy atmosphere of the restaurant. I stopped on the sidewalk in front of the Blue Lagoon, breathing deeply into the cool of the night and trying to calm my racing heartbeat. Adrenaline was still bubbling in my blood, and my hands were shaking slightly, not from old age, but from the tension of the last hour. Behind me, the party continued. Through the large windows of the restaurant, I could see the bustle. The guests were gathering in groups, discussing what had happened. Some were dancing again, pretending that nothing extraordinary had happened. The music was playing louder than before, as if the DJ was trying to drown out the awkwardness of the moment with rhythmic beats. I walked to my car and got behind the wheel, but I wasn't in a hurry to start the engine. I needed time to make sense of what had happened, to put my thoughts and emotions in order. 5 years of accumulated pain and frustration had come out in one evening, and now I felt a strange emptiness in me, as if after a long illness, when the fever finally broke, leaving my body weak but relieved. A few minutes later, the front door of the restaurant opened, and Brian Caldwell stepped outside. He looked around, spotted my car, and headed toward me. His face was a mixture of concern and embarrassment. It was clear that the owner of the place wasn't thrilled about the family scandal that had played out in his restaurant. I rolled down my window as he came closer. Mr. Hilton, he began in an apologetic tone, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. If I had realized right away who you were— Brian, it wasn't your fault, I interrupted him. You did the right thing in responding to the guest complaint. Any manager would have done the same. But it still looked terrible. Trying to get you kicked out of the restaurant. If it has any effect on our relationship, it won't. You're a good manager and an honest man. Keep doing what you've been doing. Caldwell is clearly relieved. Thank you for understanding. As for your sister-in-law, she's in a complete state of stupor right now. She's just sitting there staring off into the distance. The guests are starting to leave, and the party's effectively over. It's a shame, I said, and it was true. I didn't want to ruin people's evening. Mr. Hilton, can I ask you a personal question? Sure. Did your son really not know about your business? I paused for a moment, thinking about the answer. You know, Brian, children often have no interest in their parents' lives. They feel that parents exist only in the context of their own needs. Lance saw me as a source of financial support, a shoulder to complain on, someone who would always be there for him when he needed me. But he never thought about the fact that I might have a life of my own, interests, accomplishments. And you never tried to tell him? I tried. About 20 years ago, when he was in college, I wanted to interest him in the family business, pass on my experience and knowledge. But he made it very clear that the restaurant business didn't appeal to him. Well, I respected his choice. And uh, then it was too late to explain. Caldwell nodded understandingly. You know, my own father was a businessman too. Owned a small construction company. For a long time, I thought his work was boring and unprestigious, dreaming of something more exciting. It was only after his death that I realized how hard he'd worked to provide a decent life for our family. The difference is, I said, you realized it. Lance, I'm afraid, will remain in the dark. We were silent for a while, watching the first guests leave the restaurant. Some of them looked in my direction, recognizing the man in the car as the protagonist of the evening's scandal. Some passed by with sympathetic glances, others with curiosity. Mr. Hilton, Brian spoke again. What happens now? With the family, I mean. Nothing's going to happen, I answered calmly. There is no family anymore. There's a biological kinship, but that's about it. But we can try to rebuild the relationship, right? Explain, forgive. Some things can't be repaired, Brian. Like a broken teacup can be glued back together, but you can still see the cracks. Lance made his choice 5 years ago when he married Ivy. He chose her version of reality, where I play the role of a burden to be tolerated out of a sense of duty. Today, he just found out that reality was different. What if he tries to work things out? Come to you, apologize. Apologize for what? For not taking an interest in his father's life? For letting my wife humiliate me? For not protecting me today? I shook my head. Brian, forgiveness implies the possibility of change, and people don't change at 40. Lance will remain the same soft, gutless man who avoids conflict at all costs. Ivy will remain a selfish woman obsessed with social status. The only thing that will change is they'll know about my money. And that's a bad thing? That's the worst-case scenario. Now they'll pretend to be loving relatives, counting on the inheritance. They will visit me, give me gifts, invite me to holidays, not out of love, but out of self-interest. And it will be even more painful than the current indifference. A group of women came out of the restaurant, the same women who had listened to Ivy's stories about her infirm father-in-law. They were talking animatedly, occasionally glancing toward my car. One of them, Caroline, if I'm not mistaken, even waved at me. Apparently, her attitude toward me had changed dramatically after the truth was revealed. See? I said to Caldwell. Half an hour ago, these women were looking at me as an object of pity. They told me to look for a nursing home and find new friends among people my age. Now they're waving their hands and smiling, because I'm no longer a poor pensioner, but a wealthy businessman. People are like that, Brian agreed. Unfortunately. Exactly. And I'm too old to build a relationship on a false foundation. Better honest loneliness than a fake family idol. Meanwhile, Lance emerged from the restaurant. He stood on the doorstep, looking around, obviously looking for my car. When he spotted us, he headed in our direction at a brisk pace. His face had the determination of a man who was ready for a serious conversation. He's coming this way, Caldwell warned. I see. Do you want me to stay? I don't think so. It's a family affair, though there's not much of a family left. Brian nodded and walked back to the front of the restaurant, giving us a chance to talk alone. Lance walked over to the car and knocked on the window. I rolled it down completely. Dad, we need to talk. About what? About everything. About what happened today, about our relationship, about the future. There's no future in our relationship, Lance. Don't say that. I realize I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. I looked at my only son, at his sincere desire to mend the relationship, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Once I, too, believed that everything can be fixed, that family ties are stronger than any offenses and misunderstandings, but the years had taught me realism. Lance, be honest. If it hadn't come out today that I owned restaurants, would you have come to me to apologize? He hesitated, and that silence was enough of an answer. You see, it was only after you found out about my financial situation that you wanted to repair the relationship. Sandern. That's not true. It's just that I didn't realize how badly you and I had been communicating. You didn't? Lance, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me over for family dinner? When was the last time you let me see your grandkids? Ivy said. Ivy, I interrupted him. You're a grown man, not a puppet. You have your own head on your shoulders and your own heart in your chest. If you loved your father, no Ivy could ruin our relationship. Lance turned pale, realizing the truth of my words. Dad, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just live your life and be happy, and I'll live mine. But we can't just stop being a family. Yes, we can, and we already have. We just made it official today. I started the engine, signaling that the conversation was over. Lance backed away from the car, his face a look of confusion and despair. At that moment, I wanted to get out and hug my son and tell him everything would be okay. But I knew that would be a lie. Nothing would be okay because the foundations for a good relationship had been destroyed years ago. Goodbye, son, I said, and drove off. In the rearview mirror, I saw Lance standing in the middle of the empty street, watching the car drive away. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the restaurant, where his distraught wife and guests were waiting for him, discussing the family scandal. And I drove home through the empty streets of Rochester, feeling both relieved and sad at the same time. Relief that we no longer had to pretend that we had a normal family relationship, and sadness at the realization that my only son was forever in the past, like baby pictures in a family album. The house greeted me with its familiar silence and darkness. The large mansion in the Brighton neighborhood seemed even more desolate after the bustling restaurant and human voices. I turned on the light in the hallway, hung my coat in the closet, and made my way to the living room, where the mantelpiece was lined with photographs. Ruth as a young woman, our wedding, the early years of our life together. Lance's baby pictures were there too, but I'd long ago avoided looking at them too closely. I lit the fire in the fireplace, not so much for warmth as for comfort. Tongues of flame danced in the firebox, casting a warm orange light on the leather furniture and Persian rugs. I poured myself a glass of whiskey from the old stock, a bottle of Macallan that my business partners had given me for my 70th birthday. I'd never had occasion to open it until tonight. I sat down in my favorite chair in front of the fireplace and took a sip of expensive Scotch whiskey. The alcohol burned his throat, but the warmth spread through his chest, calming his nerves a little. The time was near midnight, but he didn't want to sleep. Too many thoughts swarmed in his head, demanding analysis and reflection. What had actually happened tonight? On the one hand, nothing unexpected. Ivy had been her usual arrogant, dismissive self. Lance, as usual, didn't have the courage to confront his wife. The guests reacted predictably, first sympathizing with the poor old man, and then changing their attitude after learning the truth. Ordinary human nature in all its glory. On the other hand, there was an important turning point. For 5 years, I lived in uncertainty, hoping for the best, clinging to the illusion of family unity. I tried to convince myself that Ivy's coldness was a temporary phenomenon, that Lance was just going through a difficult period of adaptation to family life, that sooner or later everything would work itself out. Today, those illusions had been shattered. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and found 7 missed calls from Lance and 3 text messages. I didn't read them. I knew what they said. Apologies, attempts to explain his wife's behavior, requests to meet for a serious conversation. The standard set of words people say when they realize they've gone too far. But was the remorse genuine? Or did it only appear after the extent of my condition became clear? It's human nature that we begin to appreciate what we lose, especially when we realize its true value. If Lance had found out about my business a year ago, would anything have changed in our relationship? Probably yes, but for all the wrong reasons. The fire in the fireplace crackled, consuming the wood and turning it to ash. It was a fitting metaphor for family relationships. Once strong ties slowly fading away, leaving behind only the bitter aftertaste of memories. Ruth had always said that the most valuable thing in life was genuine human relationships. She knew how to see through people, how to distinguish authenticity from pretense. That's why she didn't like Ivy right away, because she sensed the falseness beneath the mask of charm. I wish I'd listened to her warnings when I had time to change things. Now Ruth has been gone for 5 years, and I'm alone in this big house with memories and regrets. Children have grown up and left their parents' nest. That's natural, but they usually take a piece of their parents' heart with them, keeping in touch, sharing joys and sorrows. In our case, Lance simply disappeared from my life, leaving only formal congratulations on holidays and rare phone calls when necessary. Maybe it was my own fault too. Maybe I was too harsh a father, too demanding, not affectionate enough. No, that's not it. I remember reading him bedtime stories, teaching him how to ride a bike, taking him to baseball games. I remember his childish laughter and trusting hugs. When did things change? As a teenager, in college, or after marriage? I guess the process of estrangement began imperceptibly, like tooth decay. Nothing hurts at first, and then suddenly you find out that the tooth is rotting from the inside. Lance has grown up to be a soft, compromising person who avoids conflict and prefers to go with the flow. To some extent, this is my fault. I protected him too much from the difficulties of life, did not teach him to stand up for his own position. Ivy, on the contrary, grew up in a family where you had to fight for every piece. Her father left them when she was 12. Her mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. The girl early realized that in life, you need to rely only on yourself and grab everything that is badly laid. Hence her tenacity, ambition, and complete disregard for those who cannot be useful. In a union of such different people, the strongest wins. Lance became an obedient puppet in the hands of a determined wife, and I became an inconvenient obstacle on the way to social success. Nothing personal, just the rational calculation of a woman building a career as a socialite. The whiskey in my glass ran out, and I walked over to the bar to pour another. The shelf was lined with expensive liquors, gifts from business associates, a collection I'd collected over the years. Ruth didn't approve of my fondness for hard liquor, but she treated it leniently as a harmless male weakness. "Don't start drinking out of grief," she said. "Alcohol should emphasize the joy, not drown out the pain." She was a wise woman, and she was right. Today I drank not out of grief, but out of relief. The era of uncertainty and false hope was finally over. Now I knew where I stood, and I could plan my future life based on reality, not on rosy illusions. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 1:30 in the morning when the phone rang. Lance, the 8th call of the evening. I stared at the name that popped up for a long moment, deciding whether to answer. Curiosity won out in the end. "I'm listening." "Dad," my son's voice sounded agitated and desperate. "Thank you for picking up the phone. I was afraid you weren't going to talk." "What do you want, Lance?" "I need to talk. Explain the situation. I realize things look bad today, but you misunderstood Ivy's motives." "Misunderstood? How was I supposed to understand her trying to kick me out of the restaurant?" "She was under stress. The anniversary, the guests, the responsibility of the party. And then there's this unexpected conflict." "Lance," I interrupted him, "answer me a simple question. Do you think it's okay to ask security to remove an elderly relative from a restaurant?" "No, of course not. But she didn't realize who you were." "Does it matter? If I really was just an ordinary senior citizen, would that justify her behavior?" The silence on the phone dragged on. Lance tried to find the right words, but they didn't exist. "Dad, I want to make this right. Tomorrow morning I'll come to you. We'll talk calmly." "Don't come." "Why not?" "Because there's nothing to fix. Everything's already fixed. Tonight put everything in its place." "I don't understand." "You chose between your wife and your father. You chose silently, but you chose. Live with that choice and be happy." "It's not fair. I didn't choose anyone. I just..." "Just what? Just let my wife humiliate my father for 5 years? I just didn't see how she was poisoning the family relationship. I just didn't have the courage to protect my own family man from being publicly humiliated." "Dad, you have to understand. I have a difficult situation at home. Ivy is demanding. The kids are small. Work takes a lot of energy." "Excuses," I said tiredly. "Excuses. You know, Lance, everyone has moments in life that define them as a person. Today was one of those moments for you. And you failed the exam. Give me a chance to make it up to you." "Too late. Some things you can't fix, you can only accept." "But we're a family. We were family. Now we're just people related by blood. It's different." "Dad, please." "Lance," I said firmly, "don't call again. Don't come here. Don't try to reconnect. Live your life with your wife and kids. I'll live mine. What about the grandkids? You love them. I did. But the kids I've barely seen in years. I've been a stranger to Ethan and Haley for years, thanks to your wife's efforts. You can change that. It can be changed. But I don't have to. I don't want to be a self-serving grandfather who's tolerated for a possible inheritance. You think it's about money? It's not about the money? Lance, you've only called me like 10 times in 5 years. Today you've called me 8 times in 3 hours. Coincidence? More silence. My son knew I was right, but he couldn't even admit it to himself. Goodbye, son, I said and turned off the phone. Then I turned it off completely so as not to tempt myself with the possibility of answering new calls. I sat in silence for a while, watching the fire in the fireplace and thinking about the strangeness of human relationships. How easily we lose the most precious things, taking them for granted, and how difficult it is to rebuild when we realize the magnitude of the loss. But most importantly, I no longer felt guilty. For 5 years, I berated myself for my inability to find a common language with my daughter-in-law, for lack of patience and understanding. Now it was clear that it wasn't me. Ivy had seen me as an obstacle to her ambitions from the start, and Lance had been too weak to protect the family values. The fire in the fireplace was slowly dying down, turning the logs into smoldering embers. The time was late, and tomorrow was going to be a normal workday. Meetings, negotiations, decisions. Life went on despite the family dramas and disappointments. 3 months had passed since that memorable October night when the last illusions of family unity had crumbled. The winter in Rochester was harsh. Frequent snowfalls, heavy frosts, short gray days. But it didn't depress me. On the contrary, the cold clarity of the winter air suited my inner state. I was sitting in my office reviewing the financial reports for the past quarter. The figures were pleasing. Profits were up 12% over the same period last year. The 3 new establishments that had opened in the suburbs of Buffalo and Syracuse had performed particularly well. The investment in expanding the chain had paid off despite the general economic downturn. On the table was a stack of letters from the law firm, probate change papers. After the events of October, I had decided to revise the distribution of the inheritance. The bulk of the assets would now go to a charitable foundation that would support young entrepreneurs in the restaurant industry. I left a small amount, enough to live comfortably but not too much, to Lance and the grandchildren. Not out of sentimentality, but out of a sense of responsibility for the bloodline. During those 3 months, my son called several more times. The first calls were full of desperation and requests for a meeting. Then the tone changed. There were notes of resentment and misunderstanding. The last conversation took place before New Year's Eve, when Lance tried to invite me to a family dinner. "Dad, the kids are asking about Grandpa," he said then. "They want to see you, get presents." "The kids or Ivy?" I asked bluntly. "The kids, of course." He answered too quickly. I didn't believe it. Kids Ethan and Haley's age quickly forget those they don't see for a long time. It was probably Ivy's idea to try to repair the relationship for the sake of future financial prospects. I didn't accept the New Year's Eve invitation. Since then, the calls have stopped. Apparently, Lance realized I was serious and irrevocable, or maybe he was just tired of trying. Either way, I was relieved that I no longer had to listen to awkward explanations and fake attempts at reconciliation. But there were pleasant changes in other areas of life. Frank McCormick of the Old Port had accepted my offer of partnership and now owned 20% of the stock in that restaurant. The young man turned out to be not only an honest manager, but also a talented entrepreneur. In 3 months, he introduced several innovations that significantly increased the profitability of the institution. "Mr. Hilton," he said during our last meeting, "what if we try the concept of gastropubs in other cities? The format is popular among young people." I approved his initiative. It was nice to see the burning eyes of a man who had found his vocation and was ready to put his whole soul into it. That's exactly how I was 40 years ago, when I was just starting to build my empire. Another positive change was the renewal of old friendships. After Ruth's death, I had withdrawn into myself, avoiding socializing even with people with whom we had known for decades. Now I was back in touch with Sam Rosenberg from the antique store, playing poker with former colleagues from the restaurant association, attending businessmen's club nights. "Jack, it's like you've gotten younger," said Helen Carter, the widow of a banker with whom we danced at one of these evenings. You've been depressed the last few years, but now you're yourself again. She was right. The weight of false obligations and imposed guilt had finally lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer wasting emotional energy trying to please people who didn't appreciate my efforts. No more berating myself for my inability to find common ground with toxic relatives. No more making plans for family unity that existed only in my fantasies. Releasing my illusions proved to be a painful but healing process. Like surgery to remove a tumor, painful but necessary for further health. At the end of January, a curious episode occurred. I was having lunch at one of my restaurants when a familiar group sat down at a neighboring table. The same women who had listened to Ivy at the anniversary party. Caroline, Maggie, and two other ladies whose names I couldn't remember. They noticed me and said hello politely, but there was an awkwardness in their demeanor. Later, Caroline approached my table. "Mr. Hilton, can I talk to you for a minute?" Sure. I wanted to apologize for that unfortunate party. We didn't know what was going on and, well, we weren't very tactful. It wasn't your fault, I reassured her. You were reacting to the information you were getting. Yeah, but it's still awkward. How's your son doing? We haven't seen Lance and Ivy at a common event in a long time. Russ. I don't know, I answered honestly. We don't talk anymore. Oh. Caroline was confused, not expecting such candor. I'm sorry. I'm not. She looked at me in surprise but said nothing. I guess it wasn't often you heard an older person speak calmly about the breakup of a relationship with their only son. The next week, Sam Rosenberg told me some interesting news. Ivy had come into his antique store, trying to sell the very mahogany clock I'd given her as an anniversary gift. The woman claimed it was a family heirloom, Sam said with a laugh. She talked about financial difficulties, the need to get money fast, offered to sell it for half its value. And what did you tell her? That I'd sold it 3 months ago to a distinguished gentleman. She was very angry when she realized I knew where the watch came from. Apparently, Lance's family's financial situation had taken a turn for the worse. Maybe he lost his job, or Ivy went into debt trying to maintain a social life, or maybe they were just counting on my support and now had to save money. Either way, it wasn't my problem. On a February evening, I sat in the same chair by the fireplace where I had analyzed what had happened at the anniversary 3 months earlier. I had a book on my lap, the memoirs of a famous restaurateur, but I couldn't read it. My thoughts flowed in their own way, summarizing the years he had lived and thinking about the future. 74 years old is a respectable age, but not a verdict. I have enough health and energy to live another 10 or 15 years of full life. The business is thriving. There are reliable people I can trust to manage it. My financial situation allows me not to think about money and to do things that really bring pleasure. What am I missing? A family? No. The pseudo-family I had brought only pain and disappointment. A real family is built on love, respect, and mutual care, not biological kinship and social obligations. Love? Ruth is gone forever, and no one can replace her. But I have fond memories of 42 years of happy marriage. A lot of people don't even have that. Goals in life? A charitable foundation will give me a new field of endeavor, helping young entrepreneurs, passing on experience to the next generation. A worthy task for old age. Outside the window, snow was falling quietly, covering the garden with a white blanket. The house was warm and cozy, filled with memories of a life lived. A good life, despite all the losses and disappointments. A life not ashamed to summarize. The phone lay on the table next to the chair, silent and still. There were no more calls from Lance, and rightly so. We both realized that our paths had parted for good. There was no point in clinging to the past or making illusions about a future reconciliation. The fire in the fireplace crackled, creating an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. I put the book aside, leaned back in my chair, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be a new day with its own worries and joys. In the meantime, I could just enjoy the silence and the realization that I was finally living an honest life, free from compromise and false obligations. The family ended, but life went on, and it was the right thing to do.